Welcome to the Gamification Quest podcast series, where we showcase the voices behind our new collection on gamification and game-based learning, the Sententia Anthology. I'm your host, Monica Cornetti, and in each episode, I sit down with one of our authors to explore the ideas and stories they've brought to life in their chapter. Together, these conversations reveal how creative, passionate professionals are transforming the way adults learn. Let's dive in. Hello, my name is Monica Cornetti, and I am the host of the Gamification Quest podcast. Today, I have a very special guest with me. His name is Carl Kopp. And basically, when you say gamification, game-based learning, that is synonymous with the name Carl Kopp. He is an international keynote speaker, a TEDx presenter, an author of, I would guess, well over a dozen or so LinkedIn learning programs. And he has a reputation across the globe of being a pioneer in game-based learning and gamification. So we were absolutely thrilled when Carl agreed to be an author in our new Sententia Anthology, which pre-sales just went on this week. So you can grab a copy of that book along with some great perks. Carl's chapter is called Unofficial History of Gamification, From Playful Roots to Purposeful Practice in Learning. And I was thrilled when I read this because I thought this is really good because we know a little bit of history, but it's not like anyone ever puts it together the way that Carl did for this anthology. So I know you'll really like it, but I want to ask Carl some specific questions about the chapter. So Carl, thank you so much for being a guest with me today. Really appreciate you taking time to be here.
Yeah, Monica, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here. Thank you for including me in the anthology. It was a great opportunity. And I'd been wanting to think about writing about the history of gamification. So it was a fantastic opportunity.
Well, that was going to be my first question is, what drew you to this particular topic? You've said you wanted to write about this for a while. So why this topic?
Yeah, so a long time ago, somebody on LinkedIn wrote a message like, oh, and I'm the godfather of gamification. And I'm like, what? Or they like, I study with the godfather of game. I'm like, what? That doesn't make sense. So I did some history and found out, no, that's not true at all. And then I'm like, well, no one really knows what the history is. And so that got me really curious about, well, where did this come from? How did this arise? And we've heard the story of, Pelling, and he coined the term gamification. Well, maybe not, it turns out. In the research, some literature actually showed that term before he coined it. And I know it takes years to get something approved before it's in a peer-reviewed journal. So I'm like, well, the history is not as clear-cut as perhaps we think it is. And so I thought maybe tracing that history and adding some elements and meat behind it and showing even some of the controversy or the murkiness of it would make it, more real and make it more understandable to the people that follow.
And there has been controversy about it ever since we started to do it, right? Like we hear the term pointsification, and it's just a cheap way of bribing people to keep going. And so you hear all different, and even as I've been interviewing people, authors for the book on their chapter, there's a lot of pushback from the authors on what they consider bad gamification that's being sold as great gamification. And it's not even close. So besides the idea of what really is gamification, where did it start, why game-based learning, why do you think this topic's important for the field right now?
Yeah, I think it's also important to understand, sometimes I'll get the pushback, well, our topic's too serious, or we can't do gamification or games because, we want people to understand how serious we are. And to me, it's so interesting that a lot of play, a lot of playfulness actually comes from, unfortunately, humans' pursuit of wartime. And so a lot of advances in games actually came from things like Kriegspiel, which is a Prussian book on how to do wargaming. World War II, there was a ton of wargaming. The Japanese had a whole institute that just did nothing but wargaming. And they also did then economic gaming as well, which is interesting. And then after that, people came after the war in the 50s, 60s, used wargaming, or the concepts anyway, for strategic planning and for determining market share and those kind of things. And so I wanted people to understand that the idea of using games, gamification for learning is not new, is not frivolous, is not something that just popped up in the year 2000 or whatever, but that it's been around for centuries. And it's a core, the main thing I wanted to get across was it's a core element of who we are as humans. And so to deny we don't want to use that because of this or whatever is really denying, I think, a core reason of why humans do things, and having the idea of games and gamification as a way of conveying knowledge, I thought was really important to set a groundwork for an analogy like this.
I think
Anthology.
it's so important. Yeah, it's really good because you think about, I mean, you hear it too. I heard you say it, like, we're serious people, we're doing serious work, and we can't, they're playing, if they're using games. But if we think about how learning happens, it happens through play. All of learning happens through play. At some point, and I think, it's because of what compliance, conformity, the desire to get everyone educated and push through a system, that we have to take play away because we have to study for this test and make sure that people pass it by showing them multiple choice questions, whatever that might be. But if you think back historically, that was not how we learned, and that is not how we learn best. So even as you're thinking about war games, but we also learned survival by play, right? Like how to shoot a bow and arrow. That was survival at one time. And so they practice that skill, which could seem like play of shooting a bow and arrow, but it was an essential skill to develop. So if we think about learning, play has really been historically a consistent part of how we learned. What do you think? Where do you think it got lost in that's what children do, it's not what adults do?
Yeah, so interesting. Yeah, even back in the Chinese Tang Dynasty is when card games were first invented. And the interesting thing about that is they weren't numeric card games, they were scenario-based card games. So they actually
Wow.
had scenarios on them. And they were scenarios where they were basically drinking games. So the consequence was drinking, which I think is kind of funny. Like two very human, drinking and games. But I think it's really interesting. The use of games for learning, I think, is a lot in part what's happening in the larger society. So actually, I got really interested in this topic, and I got a bunch of old books from libraries, like 1960s, 1970s, and one of them has a quote in it somewhere, and I read it one where, and I can't find it, but it said something like, board games are so prevalent in board rooms that you can't walk into one without finding a board game. And I'm like, what? Like, that just blew my mind. And I think what happened was, especially in the United States, is that it followed the conservative culture after the 60s and 70s. There was a little bit of a backlash against kind of frivolousness, and the 80s were very serious, and the go-go 80s, and Gordon Gekko is kind of a mythical figure of that time. And so I think part of that was that people decided in that particular time frame, as the country became more conservative, that games were not the right way to convey that kind of information, and we're serious. And some of it, I think, is the MBAs coming out of MBA schools were just number crunchers and just the facts, and let's just focus on profit. And so I think that kind of squashed a little bit of that playfulness out of the corporations. And then I think in the 2000s, when video games started to become prevalent, people said, well, wait a minute, here's another way that we can use that game. So I think there was a really 20, 30-year time frame that kind of squashed the idea that you could play and learn at the same time. Because a lot of people after World War II came out, and the Rand Corporation and others had developed lots of different learning games, and then they just kind of slowly disappeared, which is really interesting.
Yeah. And when we think about, like, I have a critical thinking strategy course that I'm teaching next week. And this morning I went down and dug out 6 decks of cards that I have on, and some of them are old, like Whack on the Side of the Head. I mean, I don't know how long I've had that card deck, but I know that they are ways to get that we're talking about strategy. We're talking about moving from like an operational leader to more of a strategic leader, and how do you make that jump? Well, the safest way to do that is to do some playing first, right? Like, how could this look? And so when we think about the importance of like the psychological safety, having these types of tools to use in, like you said, a business boardroom or strategy sessions, how do you think L&D can start to bring more of that into what we're doing with design, facilitation, whatever that looks like, whether it's e-learning, virtual, live in person?
Yeah, I think there's lots of different ways to do it. So I always recommend starting small. You don't have to eat all the elephant all at once. So if you're doing a live session, cards are some of the most versatile, most effective tools that you can use for game environments, psychological safety. Even if you get pushback on game, call it an activity, that works. Thinking about how games start. So a game typically starts with a problem right away, and you have to solve the problem, right? The prince has been abducted and you got to go find him, or you got to find the treasure, or the aliens are coming. Like, there's always a problem that you need to solve. And in business, there's always a problem you need to solve. So start thinking about that. I like to talk about, start thinking like a game designer. So, and stop thinking like an instructional designer. So when you start thinking about what does a game designer do? Well, they set up a situation, they set up a problem, they set up obstacles that need to be solved, they give you the tools to solve them, they require you to make important decisions that are meaningful. A lot of times in training, you're making a decision or asked to make a decision online or otherwise, and you're like, you can't, like, this doesn't matter. So make it matter, make the outcomes matter, make it realistic. I think those are ways that you can add, it doesn't mean, gamification doesn't mean turning something into a game. It means using but for those others who are listening, but the idea is that we use elements from games, like the concept of progress, the concept of overcoming challenges, virtuous cycles, all of those elements that we can add into training without ever using the word game if we don't want to. And I think designers really need to start thinking of that, especially now that AI can produce content at the drop of a hat. So if AI is producing content, then it's not content that's going to make the difference. It's the application, it's the processes that we use, it's the connection of the dots, it's the critical thinking. All of those things are embedded in elements of games. And that's, I think, where if we want to remain relevant as designers of instruction, that's the direction that we need to go.
Yeah, we were playing last night. I had a game garage session and we have a deliberate fun card deck. But what really is, so I had them building out a game using mechanics, game methodology, the course medium, all of that. But the real learning comes to me in the reflection. When we take time afterwards, like when did I allow surprise and delight? When did I push myself past just delivering an average course? How can I make this really learner centric by, what do they need to learn? And how can they learn it, like you said, without just handing it to them, but making them work for it? Some failure along the way, some practice, some feedback, some skill development. All of that is so much fun. And I was thinking as I was, I have a plastic tub that it's called design decks. And I was searching through there, and the zombie apocalypse deck is in there. It's a great deck. It's good. Carl created that, in case you're wondering. What's she talking about? What's she talking about? Zombie apocalypse. But it's a great deck. It was well thought out, and as you thought about why we're designing what we're designing. But when you think about bringing gamification, there's been criticism. Like, I love Jesse Shell. I love his books. I love the deck of cards you can play with. It's so much fun. We use it all the time. But like, he's called gamification. What did he call it? Like chocolate covered broccoli, right? And then Ian Bogue, I always forget Ian's last name, but he called it bullshit. I mean, he wasn't even being nice at all about it. So these criticism, and these are game designers that aren't or weren't, I don't know where they sit right now, but from the beginning really gave some negative pushback to gamification as a modem for design or a genre of design. So what are your thoughts on their comments?
Yeah, so that really early on, there was almost this air that no one can use game elements unless they're a game designer. And game designers, we have the corner on game elements. So how dare anyone else think about using game elements? That was kind of my reaction. Like, oh, you're being a little bit elitist there and not allowing us to use game elements. And then the more I explored game elements, the more they look like good instructional design elements. So scenario-based learning looks like a scenario-based game. If you look at the progress in a game, it looks more like the idea of making progress from one point in a learning module to another point. So it really got me kind of frustrated that they were not allowing anybody else to use this game and only they knew how to use game elements. And I think over time, people have discovered, well, wait a minute, a lot of these game elements that they're talking about are elements that are used in lots of different places. Now, some of it was BS. You've seen tools where they just, oh, you logged in, here's 1,000 points. Oh, you did
Right.
this, here's 10. So, I mean, yeah, definitely there's abuse, but there's also abuse in bad lectures, bad discussions, bad e-learning. Anything can have a negative or a positive. But it's part of the impetus behind my gamification book was, well, wait a minute, you don't own this space. It's not exclusive just to game designers. Us lowly little instructional designers can also develop games as well and game elements and put them into our instruction. In fact, we've been doing it forever. So, you look at Tiagi, who's developed games since the early 60s, and he was president of ATD and all kinds. So it's not their exclusive domain. And I think they were reacting a little bit more toward the marketing use of it, which oftentimes is crass and not well thought out, and not giving instructional designers enough credit that we would be able to intelligently apply that information and those ideas to the problems that we're solving.
Yeah. And I mean, I think there's merit in that, especially because we've seen a lot of bad gamification and people who tell us like, well, our LMS is gamified. And of course, they're just going for the low hanging fruit, something that they can easily count. And much of the great gamification is not algorithmic. I can't do an if this then because there's like this is good, better, best as far as interpersonal communication, but AI is now allowing us to have those, like we can precede it with the information of quality conversations, and then they can practice those as part of a learning program. So there is so much that's opening up to us. And with instructional design, I know I got a book, I think it's called like the Encyclopedia of Game Mechanics. It must weigh like 2 tons. But I learned a lot from studying game designers. I love what they know and I want to learn what they know. I'm not saying to take it from them but to use like, well, how could, that's solid. We could really use that in a dealing with difficult person course or a negotiations course, like so that people could practice that skill. I think there's so much we can gain from it. And when I read the early articles, I smile and I wonder, well, where do they sit now? But I think one of their concerns, and I remember reading an article that Ian had written, part of it was ethics, that we were being unethical. Like, for example, in I won't name a particular store, but like a teller checkout game where the teller gets green thumbs up if they're scanning quickly, but that benefits the company, not the teller. It wasn't for their benefit that we were playing this game. So how do you think that we can stay on the ethical side of design when we use gamification in L&D?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't mean to, when I frame the argument, it's really, at that point, it was kind of reactionary. But I think there is a lot we can learn and a lot they can learn from us as well in terms of how games work and how learning works. In terms of that being ethical, there's several examples actually in the chapter in the anthology about how OSHA cited some companies. They're in the article, but I won't mention them here. But some major companies that were abusing the idea of gamification. So I think one of the things that we have to look at is how does it affect, in our case, the learner. Are we putting the learner in a situation where they could get hurt, where they could be asked to do things that they're not comfortable doing, asked to perform at a level that is not healthy for them? So one of the things is it's always audience analysis. So even though we're asked to create the training perhaps by management, we've got to look at what is going to be the impact on the learner. And then we've got to push back on management and say, look, this might seem like a good idea, but here are the potential issues and problems that are going to occur if you just give the checkout person credit and not really frustrate the customer. So those are some things that we have to look at in terms of the ethics of it. And we have to look at our own ethics and decide how do we want to apply these aspects, psychological aspects, especially with gamification now, I'm sorry, with AI that can be done kind of automatically and without the intervention of a human. We need to be really careful about kind of the frameworks and structures and things that we put into place so that we're having the most ethical and learner friendly design that we possibly can.
As we think about like how is it used? So, we're gathering data on an individual, and how is that data being used? Is it being used to evaluate them as an employee based on achievements within this game that they're playing, or like, and who can see that information? And so there's so many things to consider as we're designing. And I know that a lot of our designers who have designed for more like Department of Defense and different entities, that they have to be really cautious that there cannot be absolutely no identification of the individual because of the ethics behind that. And it's a critical component as we're thinking about design, and a good one. And I love when I hear people talking about the ethics, because simple things like choosing to opt in and being able to opt out easily versus like it's impossible to opt out, or I didn't even realize I was choosing to opt in. Those kind of small manipulations, that we're being very cautious of that as we're designing for L&D.
Yeah,
I am so,
very important.
go ahead.
It's very important. I mean, even if you look at something like progress bars, right? Progress bars are encouraging you to complete something, and sometimes in a certain amount of time. And is that even ethical to have? Do they have to have all this information? Do you have to complete it in this amount of time? All those little things, as you indicated, Monica, are very important.
One of our favorite social media platforms, I don't know if you remember, but they used to have that progress bar. No matter how much information you gave them, you were still only 80%. And dang, come on, how much more do you need from me? But they were using all of that, and I don't know that it was unethical, but probably they were skirting a fine line there between how much information do they really need, because they're using all that for marketing purposes. So again, that need for completion on our part could lead us to not think about what kind of information that we're sharing. Yeah, that's really good. I am optimistic about the future in L&D, not optimistic about the term gamification so much as being able to design for learner-centric engagement, skill practice, not role-playing, but scenario-based, based in narrative, where they get to practice specific skills, especially in those soft skill areas. Where are you on how you feel about the future of L&D and gamification together?
Yeah, so I'm starting to look at something I call action first learning, which really is kind of going beyond gamification. So the idea is to have learners take action right away. So we know from Malcolm Knowles that adult learners learn best when they know they don't know something. So I think putting learner in a situation where they have to answer a question in a scenario, or they have to fill in a position in a narrative or something like that, I think makes lots of sense, because then you're like, oh, I thought I knew the right answer, but now I don't. And so I think the tools are allowing that to happen more and more. And I think, as you pointed out earlier, I think gamification still has a lot of baggage with it. And I think it still has, for many people, a little bit of a bad taste in the mouth concept. And so I think using the ideas of gamification, and everything evolves, right? So it used to be e-learning, and now it's just learning, right? So There used to be small chunks of information. Now it's micro learning. So things evolve over time, and I'm assuming that the term will evolve as well. But I think pushing us in the direction of using those elements intelligently, wisely, ethically, and just in our regular toolkit, I think is probably more important than talking about gamification or calling it gamification or hanging that label on it. It's more important. People used to say to me, what's the difference between games and gamification? And I would say, I want the learner to take action. I actually don't care what you call it. I just want the learner to be engaged and to be motivated by the way that you design the instruction. And I think that's a good way to think about it. So I'm very optimistic as well. I think, especially, again, as I said, with tools like AI being able to spit out content, we as designers now have to think about the engagement part. We have to think about the critical thinking part. We have to think about where the human fits into the loop. And those types of elements are what we're doing, what we're talking about as we talk about gamification evolving to gamefulness or game thinking or action first learning or whatever we're calling it at the next level. That's the direction that the field needs to move. It needs to just continue to move forward.
Yeah. And my language is probably a little bit too strong, but I always like to say, I like to put the learner at risk right away. And I don't want them to get a fear brain where they shut down, but I do want them to think, ooh, this is something I'm not sure that I know, and I should know it or want to know it. So what do I have to do to make sure that I get it? Especially like when a lot of times I'm facilitating other people's content. And so I'll think, well, this is a little bit dry. So how can I put the learner at risk early on so that I can keep them moving through and learning it, and giving them that information where they really don't know the answer to it. And like, it could be any of these three, and I'm really not sure which one that is. If we're going to be offering like multiple choice, it needs to be like that, not where it's so evident that one is the obvious answer and the rest are ridiculous, to really get them engaged with the learning. My thing at work, I'm always about, you have to get a 70%. And I'm like, well, what part of it was not important for them to learn? And if it wasn't important, then why are we wasting their time on it? Right? Like, it's different than school. These are adults. They need to learn this so they can use it. So if they only need to know 70% of it, then why are we doing the rest of it? Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
We can go on. I know I'm preaching to the choir, Carl. We can go on for days about this. I know. And
yeah,
I love about something like a card game is, no matter the well, there might be some demographics who don't like cards. I don't know if those are, but I know I had a father-in-law who thought that they were kind of evil, cards in general. But for the most part, people can get their brain around a card game pretty quickly. Like, oh, it's cards. All right, well, how do we play this, right? Like, what are the rules? How do you win? And so then they can dive in and be comfortable in that environment as they try new things. So I'm with you. We are not purists in our gamification design. It can look nothing like a game, or it can be designed more like a game, like a board game or an escape room scenario type thing, where it's very, very game-like. As long as the learner is engaged and learning so they can do, I'm all in. I'm all in on it.
Yeah. Purposeful engagement, not activity for the sake of activity, but activity for the sake of learning and performance and practice. I think those are really key to helping an organization be successful and to help a gamified or game or whatever experience be meaningful during it and then after as well.
After, yeah. I have to be able to do it. That's really good. I know that you had a book published recently, and it's the name completely. It's called Action First Learning, but there's another tagline. What is that? Nah,
I don't know.
Okay, but it's Action First Learning is what we would need to look up, right? Action First Learning. Yeah, by Carl Kopp, and it's 2 Ks. In case you're wondering, it's Carl with a K and Kopp with the K. So you can find that easily on Amazon. And then, of course, Carl has a chapter in our anthology, which is called Game Changers. So you can find that easily, not on Amazon yet, because we're still in the pre-sale, but within the next 3 to 4 weeks, you'll be able to find that easily on Amazon all over the globe. So if you get to that title, let me know. You got it?
Looking at all the but looking at the anthology, great Great people, great chapters. So I can't wait to read it. The action first learning is action first learning, instructional design techniques to engage and inspire.
I think it's so good. I have every one of your books up until this one on my shelf, and they don't just sit on my shelf. I dig through them frequently. They are dog-eared, sticky noted, underlined. So I have learned so much from you, and I appreciate you and your generosity in sharing what you know. It's, some people, they use fear as their motivation to not share information because, well, what if I tell other people this? And you are like just giving it to us. Here, learn this. Here, use this. And then tell me how you used it, because you're always open for that kind of information also. So I really appreciate that. From the very first time I met you, I knew that that was something different about you, and really enjoy that. So let's close this out. If I was a reader of the anthology and I read your chapter, and I am going to tell somebody that I know, I read Carl's chapter in the anthology, and this is what it really stuck with me. This is what's really important. What would you want them to be walking away with?
I think what I want them to walk away with is the understanding that play is not frivolous, that play is fundamental to who we are as people, fundamental to how societies move forward, and fundamental to how we learn. And so if they took that away and nothing else, I think that would be a successful read of the chapter.
Yeah. And I think it's so good because we would all like to pretend that, well, as adults, we're serious and we don't play. But I know that we could ask any adult and find that they find little ways of playing every day just to, get something done, to get the dishes done, to get to work, to avoid the rush hour roulette of traffic, or whatever that looks like. We're always got some kind of little game going on to help us to keep going, to progress in our work. So thank you for that. It is not frivolous. Everything we know has happened through play, and we can continue to apply that as adults. That's really good.
Yeah, one of my favorite quotes is the opposite of work is not play. The opposite of play is not work, it's depression.
Ooh.
And I just think that's such a great quote.
Yeah, because we would like to think it's a binary play work thing, but it's not.
Right, but it's not. Yeah.
Yeah, very good. Carl, thank you so much for being here. I knew I would enjoy this interview, and I totally have. And I look forward to when we'll see each other in person again. Not sure when that will be, but whenever it is, very soon, I hope that we can connect and keep learning and growing together. So, Carl, thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks for putting together the anthology. What a great contribution to the field.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Gamification Quest podcast series. If you'd like to go deeper, you can get your own copy of the Sententia Anthology, where you'll find all of our authors' chapters collected in one place. Simply go to www.sententiagamification.com/anthology. And if you're ready to take the next step in your own practice, visit our homepage at www.sententiagamification.com to explore our certification programs and our community of practice. Until next time, keep designing learning that engages and transforms.